Today we biome cycle 4 additional approaches. There is a clear winner. Will it be an obvious one, or will we uncover something new? Insta-Tank with coral day 1, 100% of the rock and sand from an established tank, dark rubble from an established tank and then placed in a dark sump, and then 100% of the water taken from the BRS160. Starting with tank 5, dry rock, dry sand, but insta-coral day 1, and we add the microbiome associated with coral tissue or what's on their skeletal structure. We've done this method many times in the past and it's worked. That said, my experience with a dry rock coral Insta-Tank is it's much more dependent on the cleanup crew and manual removal of pests than other methods. That's the case here as well. Week 1, different than all the rest, there's no dark period. Lights on week 1 and the tank looks fairly clean, but by week 2 we're already seeing a substantial amount of hair algae in the sand. The week 2 AquaBiomics eDNA diversity score an 11 percentile and the eDNA balance a 2 percentile, both pretty low. If eDNA sounds foreign to you, go back and check out episode 4 of this series on the AquaBiomics testing, because it opens a window into something totally new and a big part of what we're exploring here. Week 3, hair algae continues to grow, and by week 4 it's out of control. Note that this is just hair algae and a single tang or cleanup crew would have likely avoided this specific issue. However, at this stage of our experiment, we intentionally do not include meso or macro predators like snails and tangs for this exact reason. They would cloud or hide the performance of the microbiome and microcrustaceans in the tank. We're looking for layers of redundant, harmonious biome, and that's what this experiment is all about. Week 4, we got another eDNA report. Diversity still in the low 7 percentile, but the biome balance, or the right things, jumps all the way up to 86 in just 4 weeks. So the tank has a lot of hair algae. What we can't see is a microbiome seeded by the corals has migrated throughout the tank. It might be preventing the other uglies, but not the hair algae. Week 5, this is the point with the other 11 tanks we turned on the LPS lighting, but that's already been done here. We retuned the lights to match the others, however, same par, but visually works better on camera for the experiment. The green algae continues to grow, but not much else on the rock and sand. One thing I do want you to take note of is the purple slime on the xenia rock. It goes on a road trip to other parts of the tank in the future. Also notable is in week 5 is when we see the first signs of microcrustaceans and pods in the tank. Week 6, the hair algae miraculously shrinks back and thins out into a wispy version of last week. Week 7, it turns brown and unhealthy and more microcrustaceans. Week 8, that trend continues and the hair algae is almost gone. Week 9 is the week we cleaned all of the tanks and everything looks pretty good. Week 10, rather than growing it all back, it disappears even further. Interestingly enough, the diversity drops to the 3 percentile, but the balance strong in the 71 percentile. And this Insta-Tank approach produced a microbiome balanced better than 71% of the tanks that AquaBiomics has tested. The big question is what caused the hair algae to die off like that and basically disappear from the tank? We changed the light spectrum. That could change the growth rate, but unlikely to outright kill it. Could be the balanced biome. After all, a healthy, balanced biofilm on the rock is what the community has largely believed prevents algae from settling and growing on the rock. But note, while the balance score was good, the biome family that the AquaBiomics team suggests is the primary contributor to the tank's biofilm, Rhodobacter is not represented here. Another possibility is the microcrustaceans and pods and maybe even flatworms are grazing on algae more than many would have thought. I believe that microcrustaceans are at least partially the answer. There certainly are a lot more signs of microcrustaceans in the tank when the algae is almost gone. There is also a significant population of other scavengers like red flatworms or planaria, which most of us would like to avoid because they're toxic, eat pods, and can pester corals. But I'm also told they eat biofilms on surfaces, which might be why the Rhodobacter, which is primarily responsible for the tank's biofilm, is just not developing in this tank. Okay, week 11, this is where the other tanks got the lights cranked up to the SPS zone, but we'd just kill these corals if we did that. So this is the next 5 weeks still in the LPS zone. Visually, I believe that this tank was going to be a winner. Week 12, it looks great, no slimes, no algae. Week 13, great as well, with the exception of the flatworms all over. Week 14, we start to see the purple slime I mentioned before, but it's no longer on the xenia, now on the top of the tank. Week 15, it spreads further, and at this point, I think it'd be valuable to get a sneak peek into phase 2. That purple slime spreads to most surfaces, and most people here thought it was some form of cyano, but it is very difficult to remove, and when you get some off, it comes back rapidly, something that we'll get to more in phase 2. The Insta-Tank coral finished a 15-week cycle with an increased biome diversity of 26th percentile, but the balance plummeted all the way to the 46th percentile once this purple slime got established. If it is cyanobacteria, it would make a lot of sense that the microbiome was disrupted. Again, it's notable that the Rhodobacteriaceae, which the AquaBiomics team suggests is the primary contributor to the tank's biofilm, is still not largely present in week 15. We can't help but wonder if it's those proliferation of red flatworms preventing the biofilm and contributing to letting the purple slime win the battle for habitat and resources. Overall, while I have personally set up a slew of Insta-Tank dry rock tanks with LPS coral and lower intensity light, I've always set them up with a strong dependence on utilitarian fish and cleanup crew day one. This tank would have likely had a much different path with tangs, snails, crabs, and algae, a wrasse cleaning up those flatworms, and potentially a strong resulting biofilm to fend off some of the slimes, which were about to get much worse in phase 2, and we will find these answers. Next up, dry rock and dry sand, but we seeded the microbiome with a small amount of rubble from an established tank's dark sump. In this case, it was rubble from my 360-gallon tank. The dark rubble path has had some ups and downs, but ended up being one of the best performing methods in the entire experiment and one of the 4 that beat back the worst of the pests introduced in phase 2. I believe there's some reasons that are fairly clear as to why taking rubble from a dark area of a sump, an established tank, then putting it in the dark area of a new tank worked at establishing the healthy microbiome without establishing a slew of thriving photosynthetic pests. Week 1 is clean like the rest, but what's unique here is there's already signs of microcrustaceans showing up in the tank. Putting the rubble in the chamber with the return pump is spreading them around. Week 2, we see more signs of pods, a diversity percentile of 13, fairly low like most tanks, but the balance is a 24 percentile, which is actually the second best of the 12 tanks at this point. Week 3 is still clean, no signs of slimes or pests. Week 4, or the last week of the dark period, still looks like new with the exception of putting established rubble in the sump are definitely spreading microcrustaceans and pods throughout the tank. You can see a lot of the spirobrid worms around. At week 4, the diversity score drops to a 4 percentile and the balance more or less unchanged at the 20 percentile. But you're seeing some of the 5 major families establish themselves. Week 5, we turn on the LPS level lighting, everything looks clean. Week 6, the diatoms show up, and just like the rest are gone by the following week, but this time replaced by green film in week 7. Week 8, that clears up as well. Some less desirable organisms popping up their heads, but then gone as fast as they came. The result of naturally competing organisms in a war that none of them completely wins. Week 9, what seems to be some stringy cyano shows up, and by week 10, spread to the sand, so there is some limited cyano here, which is common to new tanks, but no signs of algae. eDNA diversity still a 3, but the balance jumps all the way up to the 79th percentile and the 4th best in this experiment at this point. 3 of the 5 major families match a typical sample as well. In week 11, we crank up the lights, the SPS zone at 200 to 350, and we'd expect the cyano to take off. In week 11, it does progress, but in week 12, nearly disappears with only one small patch left. Week 13, that small patch gets smaller, and week 14, almost non-existent. But there are signs of hair algae and chrysophytes in the back now. Week 15 still pretty darn clean, but a bit of cyano is back. Diversity score jumps up to the 12th percentile, and the balance jumps up to a couple points to the 81 percentile, or better than 81% of the healthy tanks that AquaBiomics has tested, and the 3rd best balance score at this point in our experiment. There is a huge difference with this tank versus many of the others. It's not that this is a sterile tank, nor is it biome of the sea. It has a microbiome from a multi-year tank in it, established from the rubble. The balance score suggests that, and seeing is believing with all of the microcrustaceans on the tank. What you don't see in the tank is after 11 weeks of lighting, is tons of photosynthetic pests completely taking over the tank, just bursts of normal behavior. I believe it's because the rubble that we used for this lived in the darkness of the 360 sump, and then when we migrated to this tank, we put it in the dark area of the tank as well, and then we let the microbiome spread throughout the tank for a month before turning the light on. If there's one takeaway from all this, it's that established donor media that doesn't see light and not placed in the light can likely help start a tank with a lot fewer of the photosynthetic problems. That brings us to the next tank. This is 100% of rock and 100% of the sand taken from my 360. So this is the exact same tank with the rubble that we just saw, but the difference here is the rock and sand was exposed to light. And even after a month of dark period, it still came back and created a totally different experience. This is a great contrast for visually the same microbiome seeded in different ways. Week 1, you can see the Marco rock has a lot more growing on it. We even see hitchhikers like crabs and fan worms. Week 2, basically the same. Oddly enough, this tank has the worst microbiome diversity, or 3 percentile score, but the best balance of them all at the 31 percentile just 2 weeks in. Week 3, you can see the rock is lightening up and losing some of the gunk or organics on the surface. By week 4, it looks substantially cleaner. Essentially, we're dark curing this rock for these 4 weeks. Microbiome diversity drops to a 2 percentile, but the balance score jumps up to a 72 percentile, or the second best before turning the lights on. 4 of the 5 major microbiome families present, and clear signs of microcrustaceans. Week 5 LPS or low PAR lights come on, near instant diatom bloom. Week 6, similar to the Rubble, the brown is immediately replaced with a green film, redundant behavior, but what's different here is in week 7, rather than going away, that green film immediately turns into a rapid hair algae growth. In week 9, we have the makings of a hair algae farm. I believe the difference here is not just about the presence of pests or how they were introduced, but also the resources that it needs to thrive. In this case, I believe 2 things are happening. First, these surfaces still all had photosynthetic organisms just waiting for the opportunity to grow. Second, the established but used sand contains a lot of organics and nutrients, which are essentially fertilizing the algae. Both of these things we also saw in Steve's tank, where he used 2 cups of donor stand from that tank to establish a microbiome, and the hair algae only grew where we mixed in the sand. End of story. I'd never use used aquarium sand again without thoroughly cleaning it, which would also eliminate the desirable microbiome. Week 9, we give the tanks a reasonable clean, which consists of just siphoning the sand and blowing off the surfaces. And week 10, just like Steve's tank, the algae doesn't grow back in the sand. My best guess is we buried most of the photosynthetics by turning it over, and the microbiome or biofilm in the sand is just reestablishing after the move. Diversity is 6 percentile, and the balance still doing well at the 69 percentile at this point. Week 11, we turn on the SPS lights. You can see the hair algae move to the rock, but ebbs and flows throughout the weeks. Week 12, receding. Week 13, more or less the same. Week 14, some significant patches, and then receding a bit again in week 15. The diversity score at this point, a 14 percentile, and the balance drops to a 51 percentile, with just 2 common families making up more than half of the tank's microbiome. It's notable that the coralline algae is also disappearing in this tank. The alkalinity did drop at one point, but watching the footage, I believe it was likely from cranking up the lights and bleaching it. I get mixed feelings about this approach because the only real issue was hair algae, which is easy to beat. This is also one of the 4 tanks which beat the worst of the worst from phase 2 and pest introductions, but 100% of the rock and sand from an established tank really isn't a method that most people could replicate. And to be frank, we had better results from just putting some of the rubble from an established tank in the sump. A small amount of rubble from that established system is probably a more realistic solution for most reefers. Next up, dry rock, dry sand, but 100% of the water transfer from an existing tank, that tank being the 7-year-old BRS160. If water transfer alone was going to transfer biome, this would be it. You be the judge. Week 1 with 100% of established water looks good, as well as week 2. AquaBiomics week 2 eDNA diversity coming in at the 10 percentile and balance 14 percentile. There is one notable difference about the balance profile here, and it's that it's one of the 2 tanks that had a reasonable level of free-living bacteria that lives in the actual water column, the Bacteriaceae, in just week 2. Makes sense because it's the water that we moved over in this case and not surfaces like live rock or sand. Week 3 looks clean, and week 4 as well. At this point, the eDNA diversity drops to the 1 percentile, and this is as low as it gets. After 4 weeks in the dark, the balance isn't much better at the 20 percentile as well. Week 5, we turn on the LPS lights, immediate diatom bloom on the rock and sand. Week 6, it's gone with just some remnants in the sand. Week 7, totally clean. Week 8, we start to see the green and brown show up. By week 9, there's a variety of photosynthetic organisms growing in the tank. In week 10, this tank looks like it's going to take a turn for the worst. eDNA diversity now a 7 percentile and the balance of 46, which is tied for 4th worst at this point in the test. It is notable that this increased surface algae or chrysophytes coincides with very little of the major biofilm contributing family, Rhodobacteriaceae. Week 11, we crank up the SPS lighting, and I would have expected the algae or chrysophytes to take off, but instead it actually weakens. Week 12, it continues to weaken. Week 13, the algae basically looks bleached out. Continues into week 14, and by week 15, fairly clean. Diversity 15 percentile and balance of 46 percentile. Hard to say why algae disappeared like that when the lights cranked up. I have a suspicion that most of what we were looking at was a form of filamentous chrysophyte, which may not do very well in intense light, or could be in the nutrients or the microbiome. Reality is, with the water, we only added some of the biome, but we did add some of the photosynthetic pests as well. It did end up in a decent place, but based on eDNA, some of the visual challenges, and ultimately where the tank lands in phase 2, 100% of water from an established tank is not in the top half of our performers. Just a sneak peek, this is where this tank lands. It's the ugliest place of them all after we add the pest organisms to the tank. That leads us to the final 4, wet Gulf rock shipped in water and the most live, purple real reef rock, which is cured in saltwater, Aquaforest life source mud method, and the biobrick transfer from a multi-year system. There are 2 winners here and 2 losers. It's time to see who wins.